Holders of public office in Massachusetts also had to take an oath that they, quote, believe in the Christian religion and have a firm persuasion of the truth, which certainly wouldn't have excluded many Americans at the time, but public officials had to take that oath. In fact, 10 of the 13 original states officially sanctioned a particular religious perspective long after passage of the Constitution, long after adoption of the First Amendment and the Religion Clause. And most states had religious requirements for holding public office, such as an elected official had to be a Protestant, a Trinitarian, and a believer in God. To vote in New Hampshire, one had to be not only a Christian, but a Protestant, a requirement that was not eliminated until late in the 19th century. Only Christians could hold office in Maryland until 1826. Only Protestant Christians could hold office in North Carolina until 1835, long after passage of the First Amendment, long after the Constitution was adopted. Even Vermont, one of the most theologically liberal states, even liberal Vermont required holders of public office to take the following oath, quote, I do believe in one God, the creator and governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good and punisher of the wicked, and I do acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments to be given by divine inspiration, and to own and profess the Protestant religion, end quote. That was the oath that elected officials in Vermont had to take to hold public office. Liberal Vermont. These laws, though certainly archaic from a modern perspective, reflected the widely held view during the founding of the American Republic that public order depended upon our political leaders being Christians. Now, I certainly wouldn't advocate any kind of religious test as a requirement for holding public office, but the fact is, the U.S. Constitution does not prevent the states from imposing religious tests for public officials in those states. It only bans religious tests for those holding national office. Remember, the U.S. Constitution set up a national government with specific and enumerated powers. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution says, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people, end quote. So that's the 10th Amendment. So under our federal Constitution, the states can pretty much do what they want to do, as long as they don't violate the Bill of Rights. The Religion Clause of the First Amendment to the Constitution merely says that the federal government can't set up an official national church. That's all it says. It doesn't say anything about what the states might do in the area of promoting religion, if they want to. The Constitution also does not forbid the federal government from promoting religion in a general way, as the Continental Congress had done in 1780 when it authorized, among other measures, the printing of a Bible, so long as it was orthodox. The First Amendment was not supposed to contradict the Northwest Ordinance, which was first passed in 1787 and reenacted again in 1789, which set aside federal lands and funds, taxpayer money, for the purpose of building schools in order to, quote, promote religion, morality, and knowledge, such things being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, unquote. That was the Northwest Ordinance. Justice Story was even more specific. Appointed to the Supreme Court in 1811 by the father of the Constitution, James Madison, Justice Story is considered probably the foremost authority on the Constitution and what the Founding Fathers intended when they wrote the Constitution. And in his huge multi-volume work on American constitutional law titled Commentaries on the Constitution of the United States, Justice Story wrote this, quote, the real object of the First Amendment was not to countenance, much less advance Mohammedanism or Judaism or infidelity by prostrating Christianity, but to exclude all rivalry among Christian sects and to prevent any national ecclesiastical establishment, end quote. That was Justice Story, his reading of the First Amendment, and of course he was appointed to the Supreme Court Chief Justice by James Madison, the author of the First Amendment and the father of the Constitution. What could not occur under the American system of government was the establishment of, for example, the Baptist Church as the official church of the nation. But it was clear, in the view of Justice Story and everyone else at that time, that the federal government could be a friend to Christianity in general, and would be expected to be so since Americans were overwhelmingly Christian. The word culture, in fact, stems from the word cult, which means system of religious belief, if you look it up in Webster's dictionary, because all cultures rest on certain religious presuppositions. They all rest upon a system of religious belief. That's why in our culture, which is based predominantly on Protestant theology, it looks so different from cultures based, for example, on the Islamic faith, or Hinduism, or Buddhism. It's the underlying religious tradition that ultimately shapes the politics of a country. And that was certainly the case here in America, which was a product of Puritanism. It's also why America looks very different from Catholic countries. The Catholic Church is more top-down in its government structure, so that affects the kind of political structures, which tend to be less democratic and more feudal, that emerged in Europe and Latin America. So the religious beliefs of the people have a big impact on the political traditions of a country. It was really only in America that the Puritan idea of governance was allowed to blossom without all the religious wars between the Protestants and Catholics that occurred in Europe, Oliver Cromwell and so on. Here in America, Puritan ideas of democratic governance, the idea that power corrupts, and basically all the theological ideas that are key to the American political system were allowed to take root here. The American Revolution is sometimes referred to as the Second Puritan Revolution. Oliver Cromwell's revolution in England ultimately failed, but Puritan principles of governance took root here. There would be no king here in America. We would be a nation governed by law, not by men. That's a Puritan idea. Because human nature is corrupt and because government power corrupts, we would have divided government here in America, checks and balances with each branch of government balancing out the other and providing a check against the other. We would have a Bill of Rights. We would have a federal government. We would have state governments that would act as a check against the federal power. It was all about divided government here, keeping government in its proper place, in its proper role, because if you allowed government to get out of its proper role, the Puritans believed that government would ultimately become corrupt and tyrannical. So we would be governed by the people and their elected representatives, just like the Presbyterian and the Congregationalist and Baptist church governing structures. Our government was basically a mirror of these low church Protestant church governments, Puritan, Congregationalist, and Baptist. So the idea that our government would have no religious perspective whatsoever would have struck our founding fathers as absurd. A government of the people should reflect the values of the people it's supposed to govern, which is why one of the initial acts of the first House of Representatives was to elect a chaplain, a fellow by the name of Reverend William Lynn. Reverend Lynn was paid an annual salary of $500 out of federal funds, and James Madison, who originally proposed the First Amendment, sat on the committee that recommended that Congress needed to hire a chaplain. Congress still has chaplains. There's a chaplain in the House and a chaplain in the Senate today, a tradition that started with James Madison, with the founding of the country. Also passed, the day after the First Amendment was adopted, was a National Day of Prayer and Thanksgiving, a holiday we still celebrate. Madison, as president, issued at least 4 Thanksgiving Day proclamations. Here's part of James Madison's Thanksgiving Day proclamation. Quote, "The Senate and House of Representatives of the United States have, by a joint resolution, signified that a day may be observed by the people of the United States with religious solemnity, as a day of thanksgiving and of devout acknowledgement of Almighty God for his great goodness manifested in restoring to them the blessings of peace." But Madison goes on, "No people ought to feel greater obligations to celebrate the goodness of the great disposer of events and of the destiny of nations than the people of the United States. His kind providence originally conducted them to one of the best portions of the dwelling place allotted for the great family of the human race. He protected and cherished them under all the difficulties and trials to which they were exposed in the early days. Under his fostering care, their habits, their sentiments, and their pursuits prepared them for a transition in due time to a state of independence and self-government." End quote. So Madison connected the religious mission. The original Puritans who came here, he connected their religious views to the founding ideas of the country.